Today is May 11th, 2016. I'm with Mr. James Kelly, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and the Pacific. I'm Lai Leong for the Center for Presidential History. And
I'm Brian Franklin with the Center for Presidential History.
Okay. Mr. Kelly, thanks for being with us. May I begin with asking you what your background was before you became the Assistant Secretary of State?
That was the first, when I was confirmed by the Senate and started work at the State Department in 2001, was the first time I had ever actually worked at the State Department. I was a naval officer because I was colorblind. I did mostly financial work in the Navy, but in the latter stages of the Vietnam War, I took a financial job that turned out to be about 98% political military over the final days of Vietnam. And then as a naval officer, but working for the Secretary of Defense in the late 70s, I was in Iran for somewhat more than a year in a unique office. And then I was Iran desk officer. About 1979, after a front row seat for the end of Cambodia, the end of the Vietnam War, and the collapse of the Shah's rule in Iran, I decided that I needed to get into another line of work. And so I returned to Hawaii, left the Navy, and intended to remain out for a long time. But the opportunity came up in 1983 to come into government as a civilian in the policy end and in East Asia. I had little familiarity with East Asia other than traveling to and from Vietnam and a little bit of experience in the Navy. And so it was a great opportunity to come in to work for Secretary Weinberger and Rich Armitage. Mr. Armitage and I, he was of course Deputy Secretary of State during the time I was there, go back into Vietnam in the 1970s. And we have collaborated on various things, and I was instrumental in bringing him to Washington ever for the first time. And then he brought me back to Washington a couple of times. I also had worked with former Secretary of State Colin Powell, going back to times when he was a lieutenant colonel in the Army in the Pentagon. And he had been my boss later on in the last couple years of the Reagan administration. And so I was out of government for 12 years, running a business for a while, and then Pacific Forum, a think tank, a part of Center for Strategic and International Studies in Honolulu. And visiting Asia, East Asia, all of the different countries, staying up with the issues. And I was still a bit astonished at a considerable age about getting ready to retire from Pacific Forum when Secretary Powell asked if I would come back and be his Assistant Secretary for East Asia. I was delighted to do that, and I was enthusiastic about working for President George W. Bush. I had not known President Bush before. I had had plenty of experience with his father, President 41, as vice president when he was so active in many things in the Reagan administration. And then I was on for the first 6 months. I had told the people I was leaving government, but I would be happy to be a transition person on Asia policy. And we got into quite a start with that because the beginning of the Bush administration was the funeral of the Emperor of Japan. So the president's very first trip was a trip to Japan and to Korea, and in particular to China. A very significant visit in early 1989, given the things that happened later on that year. But then I left government and was out for 12 years, as I mentioned, and then came back in 2001. So it's an unusual and checkered experience, but one that I feel very fortunate to have had.
Did you have a chance to meet President Bush too before you assumed office?
I did not have a chance to meet him before. I met him soon afterwards and was a regular visitor over there and saw a good bit of him on various other times. But I had not personally met the president until after he was president.
What were your first impressions of what he knew about Asia and his attitude towards Asia?
The beginning process, he was interested in reviewing the policies of the past. And so I was not present for the initial meeting with President Kim Dae-jung of Korea. That is marked as a big setback. It really wasn't as bad as has been described, but and much of it was responsibility of the South Koreans themselves. I had met with various South Korean leaders, short of President Kim, whose attitude, particularly with the then National Security Advisor of South Korea, was when is President Bush going to come to visit North Korea? They were looking for the follow-up for the Nobel Prize winning visit that President Kim had had. And so much of my earlier context and much of the whole context of dealing with President Bush was on that topic. Also, one of his first major trips in 2001 was going to be to the APEC leaders meeting, which was to be held and was held in Shanghai just a month or so after 9/11, as it turned out. And I think that developed in very uncertain ways. But I think that President Bush was neither familiar nor awfully interested in most Asia policies. In some respects, I think the president was determined to not fall into traps that perhaps he believed that his father had fallen into. But one area which he did agree with his father was in the importance of a relationship with China. And this was certainly affected on 9/11 itself. The Chinese networks reported it, but did not go to the full coverage. Phoenix Television of Hong Kong, which is certainly oriented to the PRC, but quite independent, went to, of course, complete coverage of this. What was 9 o'clock in the morning in New York was, I think, essentially 9 or 10 at night in China. And it's my understanding that President Jiang Zemin of China was really struck watching every bit of this unfolding. It's a real indication of how modern media changes the effect of policy. But I'm not sure which of this is truly fact or not. But it's my understanding that President Jiang called the Foreign Ministry of China somewhere about 11 o'clock at night and told them he wanted to, get a condolence message out immediately. It was received in Washington basically about noon, and one of the first meetings. I think that very much struck President Bush as the kind of reaching out that suggested how we could do this, notwithstanding just 3 or 4 months before we'd had a lack of communication over the forced landing and air accident involving the P-3 and the Chinese fighter plane.
I'm going to get much more into 9/11 in just a minute. But before that, you said that President George W. Bush was quite keen not to make some of the mistakes or missteps that his father perhaps had made with regards to Asia. So China aside, where they both agreed on its importance, where were the areas of disagreement?
Well, this is a very personal observation, but I would say one was that he would never get on the wrong side of the right wing of the Republican Party. And it was a little frustrating because individual conservative senators would hold up appointments and little things that even a word from the president would have moved them. But we took it much more the long way. And then I think that he believed that his father had made a mistake in not going on to Baghdad in the first Gulf War. And if you look at the book, A World Transformed, that the elder President Bush and Brent Scowcroft wrote, there are 3 pages that describe why they did not go on to Baghdad that represented what they believed, I guess, about 1996 or 94 when the book came out. And you could look at them today. I did look at them in 2001 and 2002, and they were they were gilt-edged. Those reasons were very cogent, but for whatever reason, President Bush didn't go along with that, and that, I think, was part of the reasons for going ahead with the Gulf War or the Iraq War. But those would be 2. I think there were others. I did hear the president say on one occasion on an overseas trip that he was describing his father at Kennebunkport with 3 channels. He had a television that he could watch 3 different channels at one time. And he was using earphones to listen to it because Mrs. Barbara Bush didn't want to have all that noise going on here. And the president, the younger President Bush, said he knows that his father is just busting to give him instructions, but that he would rather die than try to instruct his son on how to be president. And that he said, that does not extend to my mother, who will certainly give me advice when she thinks it's necessary. And I think he was simply stating the reality that the elder President Bush, with his view of the world and the presidency, wasn't about to try to stir his hand around with his son.
Was there a conscious decision on the part of President Bush II in terms of correcting the course as far as Clinton's policies were concerned in Asia?
Yes, I think that was particularly true with North Korea, and that's what led to the policy review of it. That was, I think also there was a sense of running a more active policy throughout with Asian countries. A lot of this is a difference between what the president believed or may have believed at the time and what various other officials. I think there was a broad specific skepticism. I think Don Rumsfeld in particular had a great deal of skepticism about China and was interested in running up those tensions. But 9/11 certainly intervened, and the various other things, so that in fact, as it worked out, there was really a continuation of all the former presidents working an important relationship with China, recognizing the complexities of what was going on. President George W. Bush, as with any president, was certainly struck by personalities involved. And to give two anecdotes in that respect, his relationship with Prime Minister Koizumi, they really hit it off very well from the start. Koizumi had a populist success as a Japanese prime minister, but in particular, President Bush believed that when Koizumi told him he was absolutely going to do something, that his word was good, that he was not a foreign leader who was just going to say something to get credit for it and then ignore it. And on that basis, that they could have a sound working relationship, and they did in that respect. And so that really strengthened, I think, the U.S.-Japan alliance in that respect. The other case was Australia, and we're going to see Ambassador Schieffer today. But I think, like many Americans who are not day-to-day involved in foreign policy, Australia and Canada's greatest fear is being taken for granted. Nice places, great to visit, but not very important on this. And but Prime Minister of Australia was visiting Washington and had a lunch with the president on the 10th of September. And then because of the shutdown of all the planes, he remained in town. I think that they were, that John Howard, the Prime Minister of Australia, and President Bush were really able to establish a bonding in that process that was not really what we had seen before. I think on 9/10 it was much more, okay, they're in a lie, good people, conservative, reasonably conservative Prime Minister, this is somebody we can work with, but it's just one of a lot of important, reasonably important allies that we need to do. That became a closer cooperation afterwards, and once again marked by the kind of honesty among leaders that President Bush respected, and that isn't all that common. So that Howard told him, yes, he would participate in Iraq, but he also made clear that he was not going of where the limits to Australian participation were going to be, and honored those, and that was understandable. Others, for example, President of the Philippines, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, sent off troops to Iraq, and some businessman got grabbed as a hostage, and she pulled them all out. That's not what an ally really does, and it's contributed, I think, to some of the problems that we see now. Not the action of doing it, but the fact that the Philippines is just going to do what Philippine leaders think they ought to do, and they're operating on short-termism and not looking at anything, which does in fact mark Philippine politics for quite a long time.
In addition to the Philippines, was there a sense in the first 9 months of the Bush administration, was there a sense of a need to reset any relationships with the rest of Southeast Asia?
I don't think so. I think there was an assessment I think my first trip down there was certainly very interesting to me. I don't know that it was that significant within the administration, but my work with Chinese diplomats through the 80s these were very much the ex-Cultural Revolution Chinese leaders who were inflexible, endless lectures about Taiwan, endless lectures about the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, enough to send you to sleep on these things. Very reluctant policy, fearful group, although some obviously had some real talent. When I came back 12 years later, and I had participated in many Track 2 things, which was often with retired Chinese diplomats. Well, these are the same guys as before. I was really struck, and in Southeast Asia, they would send various other very stiff diplomats who did not know local languages and if anything, ran zero or low content policies with Southeast Asia. By 2001, this was very different. Very well educated, very able, capable diplomats were dispatched around Southeast Asia. People who really did understand what was going on. I recall coming back even in 2001 say the Chinese are having our lunch down there. Because so it was of inattention, and so to the degree I think that this was emphasized in the administration was to renew our attention, particularly in Southeast Asia, over what was going on.
Let's move on to 9/11 itself.
Mm-hmm.
Where were you on 9/11?
I was in the office in the morning.
In Washington, D.C.
Yeah, you had, when I came back, there was a much more casual attitude in handling intelligence matters and intelligence reports in the 1980s than there was in 2001. And so to read certain kinds of intelligence, you would go into a particularly cleared space that was unique, and we had something like that in our office. And so I was heading on in there, and there was just a report of some plane that hit one of the Trade Center towers in New York. By the time I came out of this sealed room, it was apparent that it was a large plane and there was this huge fire going on. And then I still remember coming out of that thing, I heard a strong boom and a distant boom. And I went over to my deputy's office, which looked in the direction of the Pentagon, and all this smoke was coming from the Pentagon. And about that time, the department was evacuated, and I managed to get my car out of the basement and headed home to an apartment across the street and started watching television like everybody else, and watching the day's things that happened, and of course it's obviously affected so much of government and foreign policy in the years since then.
What was the first thing you did as somebody in government? Were there phone
after
calls you
9/11?
made? Well, on 9/11 or on the immediate days after?
Well, it had to do with we had an Australian prime minister there who couldn't go anywhere, and he had Secret Service protection there, and I think they took him to the embassy, and then they took him out to the ambassador's residence. He was supposed to fly out, and he couldn't. And so I recall that much of our effort was, how do you take care of a extra prime minister around town? And and then dealing with all of the support and condolences that were coming in from really everywhere, and how that would go. So Asia was not East Asia was not part of the main effort of this, and so we were doing our gardening, as Secretary Schultz used to put it, and that's very much, I think, the way that I saw my job. Is the gardening is to keep in touch with all of these countries and make sure we get to know them, understand what their concerns are, be in touch with our missions and our ambassadors that are there, and then make adjustments to policy as may be needed or appropriate.
The messages of condolences and support that you received from Asia, were there any specific offers of material support or intelligence support? What aside from condolences?
Well, most of these came to the White House, of course, and so that at the time, I think Torkel Patterson was the senior director. I don't know if you've talked to him or not. Torkel's a very wise person, and then he was succeeded, I guess, by Jim Moriarty and then Mike Green afterwards. But so they saw more of these messages. But I think initially it was the sort of support you get after a fire or a disaster or a tsunami. I noticed that the Canadians have rejected with thanks offers of aid from other big countries, and certainly including the U.S. on this fire that's burning up Alberta, and they can take care of it. And that was, I think, much of the sort of thing that came in. More than that, though, of course, NATO invoked Article whatever it is, that attack on one is an attack on everyone, and that was a very significant action that NATO took. But I don't recall that coming up in any particular way with the Asian countries. We weren't trying to get anybody to sign up. We had as good a cooperation as we needed, I think, at that time.
How long after 9/11 was there then new talk, perhaps, of how to rethink Asia policy in light of 9/11?
I don't think there was a discussion of that sort. The upcoming trip to Shanghai for APEC was before us, but I think East Asia was not viewed as an area that needed to have a policy fix, other than an attention to terrorists that might exist in that area. And in that respect, the support to the Philippines, I think, was most significant. And it's still, the island of Jolo still has Abu Sayyaf. Abu Sayyaf has some sort of links now with the Islamic State, but in those days it was links with Al-Qaeda. But really it's just links. Abu Sayyaf is after money and power in the local sense, and money in the things by kidnapping, and they've been doing this for they've been doing this with America involved since about 1901, and this is what the .45 caliber pistol was invented for, was these guys. And there was some other shootout within the last few weeks on the island of Basilan, off in the Sulu Islands. This is the same old bunch, and the armed forces of the Philippines have essentially done a terrible job of dealing with this over all these years, although it's definitely a difficult and challenging adversary. But this is not something that was cooked up at the instigation of the Islamic State, although the Islamic State may, through some of its contacts in Indonesia, be in some kind of touch with them. But basically they're doing what they do because that's what they do. And so other than that, with the Chinese, how bad is a Uyghur terrorist? This was something that would be on the margins of the war on terror. I think we did find one Uyghur group that clearly seemed to be guilty of terrorist acts and put them on the global terrorism list. But the Chinese had a long list of literally every other organization that involved Uyghurs, and in the government of China lexicon, terrorist equals Uyghur, and just as cult equals Falun Gong, and they'll do whatever is necessary to suppress these people. This was not mainstream, but it was significant, particularly with some individuals that had developed a reputation for openness and coming out. But that was kind of with Japan and Korea, even North Korea. North Korea's subsequently identified contacts with Syria, the contacts with Iran that go back a long way were certainly a part of it, but this was more of a state-to-state issue than the unstated one, although it remains probably the greatest element of the nuclear threat from North Korea. It would be the idea of transferring weapons or fissionable material to a non-state actor.
What about the attention towards when did the policymakers start to think of Southeast Asia as a second front for counterterrorism?
I don't think second front would have been but early on, because and it certainly affected our relationship. The Afghans, how many Indonesians were in Afghan? There were early on some Indonesian-rooted terrorists that were identified. Indonesia was itself going through a national upheaval after the fall of Suharto in 1998, and Habibie, and then President Gus Dur, and the transition to Megawati Sukarno-Putri as the president. I would say that the anti-terror capabilities of the Indonesians were near zero at the time. Even the police were a part of the army at that time, and they just were missing the point. This is a significant effort that the U.S. did do over time, but it's not the great kind of presidential policy. It's the practical, down-to-earth working with Indonesian law enforcement and Indonesian security forces to deal with the terrorists. And just a few months ago, we saw just how good this Indonesian counterterrorist group has become. That's from zero. Of course, they were enormously pushed ahead by some of the bombings, or in particular this bar bombing in Bali of, I don't know, it was 2002 or 2003, which really caught the attention of Indonesia, and has been a part of Indonesia developing in a very good way. And this is really the whole story in East Asia. These are not countries from one end to the other that are waiting for somebody in Washington or anywhere else to tell them what to do. They're going ahead on their own in ways that, for various reasons in their histories, they've not done so. And this is why my intense interest in East Asia, which really only began in 1983, coming in, I feel so strongly about it. And this is why the pivot, the rebalance that we see at this time remains important, and why the lack of education on trade policy that we see right now is so sad and pathetic. The TPP is enormously needed and can make an enormously important contribution to U.S. interests in East Asia, and I hope we don't squander that opportunity.
I've heard from some quarters that the initial approach to Southeast Asia was almost knee-jerk. You know, there was some felt need to do something, and so the U.S. was perhaps a little heavy-handed at the beginning. Is that true?
I think that criticism is probably exaggerated, although there's no doubt some truth from some people at the bottom of it. I'm not sure exactly who would be seen as that. It's always a problem in East Asia when we have single issue policy leaders show up. It's really relatively rare, particularly in Southeast Asia, to have people show up with broad responsibilities for economic and security relations. In the end, it's really only the president, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and in his absence, Assistant Secretary of State, and maybe it's now an Assistant Secretary at the Pentagon. But other than a few people, everybody is a single issue. So come in on tariffs on cigarettes, beat the devil out of them on something like that, or drug pricing, or various things that we want them to do, and human rights or religious interests and all these sorts of things. Some of these are seen as heavy-handed. Among the Muslim countries of Southeast Asia, Malaysia would be seen as a problem because then and now essentially any Muslim country can come and go into Malaysia without a visa. And so the first instinct is tell the Malaysians, don't do this. Well, the Malaysians have perfected the efforts of when a big country tells them to do something, they're not going to do it, even if it's in their own interest. You can persuade them over a period of time, and I think what we've got is we've got them to look a lot more carefully at who's coming and going, and cooperate with us on that sort of thing, and I think that's been helpful. The visa restrictions that followed 9/11 have hurt us a lot in Southeast Asia. And this is part of why the Trump thing of banning we're going to ban 220 million people of Indonesia to come here. As I say, Indonesia is a very important country. It is a country that is really headed in the right direction, slowly, albeit it's got a long way to go. It's made remarkable progress in all kinds of things that we ought to be active in supporting. And the post-9/11 visa rules were not quite the comprehension of the Donald Trump, but they were doggone close in many ways. And Homeland Security attitude for a long time is essentially hang them all, get the guilty, block everybody out, and endless processes to get a visa because Abdullah, Ibrahim, I mean, there's so much overlap of names, and trying to get these different lists together was not very well. And although there's a possibility of getting terrorists from there, but in Korea, this day, nobody close to a terrorist has come from Korea. It's not an easy passport to smuggle. We had to do individual visa interviews on everybody. We finally got the visa waiver with Korea. We were doing 700,000 interviews face-to-face with Koreans, and then charge them $125. So a family of four is having to spend $500 and coming to Seoul to get this meaningless interview to come on. This is taking the pistol and shooting it at your foot, and it's the sort of policy we had. This is not something that President George W. Bush directed. It's a part of the reaction of the bureaucracy, perhaps an understandable reaction to the challenge of blocking terrorism. And so obviously at the beginning, it wasn't beginning because we'd had a counterterrorism effort for a long time, but it certainly had a renewed urgency and a lot more people involved in it. And so the initial efforts, I suspect, are much more skillful now.
I understand that, back to Indonesia, I understand that President Megawati was initially quite resistant.
Oh, sure.
To the idea that there could be terrorists in Indonesia, or at least she didn't want to make public admission.
But she certainly
to
didn't want to emphasize that, and she's an interesting person as the daughter of the late President Sukarno. She, as we see in recent years, she really views herself as more of a queen than president, of a ruling queen than that. And so she was one of the foreign leaders visiting the White House early on after 9/11, and this was viewed with considerable importance. But she was really in a keep it close mode, and I think stayed that way, and certainly developed no kind of a serious relationship with President Bush during that time. So it's a tribute to that we have been able to work these things better over time, and Indonesia's own development has come along in a good way.
Was it quite deliberate to invite leaders from East Asia to the White House early on in the administration?
It's always a scramble in any administration. Under our system, the president's time is invariably insufficient to do all the things that the government and the system want the president to do, and that could be helped and assisted. This is really true of the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense as well. What do they need to be personally involved in? So there's always a competition with the schedulers, who tend to be more domestically, politically involved in getting the president's time. On top of it, President George W. Bush really did not like lunches and dinners in the White House. He preferred to have a bite within his family and work out, and was not very interested in doing this. But early on, I think the importance of Indonesia, so that the visit of Megawati had been scheduled before 9/11. And so this was essentially carrying out. And of course, September is a main time because that's when leaders from all over the world come to New York to give their speech at the General Assembly, and so that's a convenient time for them to come down to Washington, and if they're somebody who's worthy, a convenient thing to come otherwise. And then others, given the importance of their country and whatever relationship their leader will have with the president, will have an easier time. Singapore, going back to the times of Lee Kuan Yew, is always welcome. Supportive, his counsel was always wise, and the same thing I think went on with Goh Chok Tong, and probably may even on to today. And so your time won't be wasted with the Singaporeans, and it's worth listening to what they're going to say, because they're watching everybody in different eyes, and in many cases wiser eyes than we are, and we need to pay attention to what they're saying. So most every administration is very happy to have the Singapore people come on in. And then Malaysia is just historically was always difficult with Mahathir, and that's now a whole separate set of issues and problems. But it's I don't think the pace of visitors, the emphasis during particular visits may have changed a bit with war and terror, but I don't think the thrust of these schedules was necessarily affected very much.
I've heard from people in Southeast Asians, who say that while they understood initially the need to focus on counterterrorism immediately after 9/11, that continued focus, especially on the military aspect of it, in Southeast Asia, not elsewhere, but in Southeast Asia, began to wear thin. Do you think that's warranted criticism?
I've heard that. It probably has something to it. I'm not sure it has all that much. It would depend on who is complaining about what. And Southeast Asian academics are really schizophrenic about the USA. They don't want to be pushed around. They don't want to be taken for granted. But above all, they don't want to be ignored. So there's a constant balance. If they're seeing us too much, well, we're asking them to do things that they don't want to do. And if we're seeing them too little, that's even worse. And I suspect that, which goes back, well, it goes back to the founding of ASEAN, because the changes in Southeast Asia over the last 60 or 70 years, economically and politically, are just immense. But I've always been so struck with ASEAN itself that leaders in these countries in the 50s and 60s, they didn't know each other at all. Their orientation was to their colonial masters, with the exception of the Thais, and or in the case of Vietnam, the war and with the French, and then with these other things. And so the aspect of ASEAN was the ultimate confidence building measure, because all of these meetings among not so much with others, but among the ASEAN countries, introduced them to each other. Their military leaders soon had 3 times a year golf dates with each other. Well, back in the 60s, Indonesia and Malaysia, they were punching each other out, and there was some loss of life then. The breakaway of Singapore and from the Malay states was a painful process, Well, so much of this has been resolved over this time. It's a different set of problems. And then when you couple this sort of political openness and familiarity with the enormous economic growth that's gone on, that's affected everybody in one way or another, even the Philippines. When all this began, other than Japan, Philippines was by far the wealthiest country in Asia. And they've fallen so badly. They're finally starting to put it together. We could discuss at length the weaknesses and strengths of ASEAN. I'll probably do that this afternoon. It's not useful for here, but it's really been a very important development.
But back to the counterterrorism efforts. Even among those who agree that there is the need for strong counterterrorism in Southeast Asia, I think the criticism was that the focus was too heavily military and enforcement and maybe intelligence, as opposed to support for other aspects, the softer aspects perhaps, of supporting their societies. Any grounds for that?
It's true, but I think it's probably a hopeless undertaking. The war in Iraq was certain, and the attacks in Afghanistan were certainly never a war on Islam, and I think President Bush did about as good a job as possible to not portray that. But the rise of Al Jazeera and other Arabic channels, with the 24-hour news coverage, that particularly of Israel and Palestine and problems in the occupied territories and all that sort of thing, is brought home to Southeast Asians. And so this a common development of Islam is going on at the same time. And it's not clear that soft power could affect this a great deal. Perhaps some of the initial actions were unskillful, but I don't think the countries were necessarily all that involved or knowledgeable in that. So I'd say that some of that is probably unfixable, and the whole idea of public diplomacy and how do you do it and how do you make it effective was a problem after 9/11, and it's still a problem.
Do you think that American diplomats on the ground, the embassy staff, for instance, could perhaps have done a better job?
Certainly in some cases they might, although I don't think that that's necessarily been a problem. The security at our embassies is a problem, although I don't think we have had very much in the restrictions of our diplomats getting out around town, and a lot of them have really done exceptional work in that respect. The development assistance, by the time I came in, we were close to zero in East Asia. These were seen as countries that are doing well, probably correctly, but endless more pumping into some parts of Latin America and certainly Africa and others was and of course the vast amounts into Afghanistan and into Iraq were doing that. So we didn't have a lot of programs. I've seen some of this firsthand since I left office, but it was certainly a problem at that time. So we don't necessarily bring very much to the table, and American businesses have been a little slower to get involved in Southeast Asia. I think that's improved to a considerable extent, and could improve more with TPP. But it's a problem, and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act frightens a lot of American businesses over doing business in places. In Indonesia, the decentralization has enormously made things more politically complex than they are. But mostly, Indonesia is a huge country, and a number of diplomats in Jakarta are not necessarily going to make that much difference. And then we have a pretty well-trained consul general in Surabaya. But it's a big country, and our influence there is fairly limited.
Was it difficult getting policymakers here in DC to devote more resources to that region?
Overall, in terms of resources, I think we did get more resources there, and the war on terrorism particularly. We got some assistance for the armed forces of the Philippines, although whether they effectively use it or not is far from clear. Some of it was good, but no, I think it wasn't a big issue in Washington.
What type of resources, besides material resources, what type of intelligence resources and knowledge did the U.S. have? Did you feel that the U.S. had enough of that, or was that something they really had to build up?
It's something you have to build up over time, and it's a matter of resources. In Indonesia, particularly as an important country, working with them, and I think we've slowly done that. Apparently, a lot of trained people were pulled out of Indonesia fairly early that had worked in the various languages, not just Bahasa, but the island languages as well. So this was a slow process. It was more active in the Philippines, particularly dealing with the Muslims part of Mindanao. But even then, President Gloria Arroyo really wanted to fight to the last American. She was really after the Americans coming in and doing their war for them in their own southern part of the country. This is going to be fascinating now with the Mindanao man being elected president of the Philippines. That's never happened before. Mindanao is just viewed as a place to be exploited by the Manila elites. So I don't know that there's an awful lot to be identified there.
Was there ever any talk about the U.S. actually sending in troops or forces into some of these countries?
In a few cases, there was, well, of course, that did happen in very small numbers in the Philippines. There was some talk very early in the process on dealing with some terrorists in Indonesia, and but it was reconsidered before it got very close to the process, and so that didn't happen. I don't think anywhere else was considered, or for that matter, was dangerous enough. The whole idea is to improve the capabilities of these countries, and as I said earlier, the effort with Indonesia has really worked very well.
Were you able to do this quite easily? Was there already a sort of ready team of people and experts here in the U.S. to support those efforts?
No, to a degree, special forces and that element within the U.S. forces the foreign area training. That effort has been picked up, but it certainly existed in the 80s and 90s, and was something that could be built on in the armed forces. And it's small and individual, but it's worked in terms of the counterterrorism training to the Indonesians.
How good was our intelligence at that time?
I don't think it was very good at all. It was, as I say, we had very few people on the ground with good contacts. So they're working with technical means of imagery and other things, and could frequently come to false conclusions. I think that it was pretty mediocre.
To what extent did you have to work with countries in the region like Japan or Singapore or Australia in that respect?
Australia a good bit. The Australians over the last 30 years or so have taken much more interest in Southeast Asia in particular, and China, and they've been over there, but Australia has its own burdens, particularly with Indonesia, and so the U.S. interests considerably overlap with those of Australia, but they are not a perfect fit, and there are some areas that we would do better to do things ourselves. I think because of personnel resources, initially, we became over-dependent on Australia as information sources in a big country like Indonesia. But where there's always been a small thing, the culture of Indonesia varies a bit from island to island and among the complex different peoples that are there. But there are assorted Yemeni that have come over many, many years, Arab interests, the spread of Saudi money supporting schools, Islamic schools. Clearly, Muslim women in Indonesia are much more inclined to wear hijab, scarves, much more so than they did not all that many years ago. That hasn't really changed the culture, and those who would be potentially dangerous are really small minorities, but they're all over Indonesia, and I think at this time the authorities have a pretty good identification of where they are.
So would you say that there was a high-level dependence then on the Australians?
To a degree, not so much high level, but a moderate level. When you get, this is a Center for Presidential History, and presidents' interests are really at a large strategic sense. And so East Asia in general and Southeast Asia have always been peripheral to the war on terror. And occasionally there are important elements there. Some of the one-size-fits-all rules that I mentioned earlier, like visas, may have an adverse effect, but it's really within the context of the long-standing relationships that we've had. American interest and enthusiasm may certainly have intensified on the war on terrorism. Now it's probably a little bit more China and Southeast Asia or the South China Sea.
Do you recall if at that time the U.S. had a good sense of how the different Muslim groups in the region, so those in Indonesia versus those in the Philippines versus those in South Thailand, do you recall if the U.S. had a good sense of how different they actually were and the different motivations?
No, I don't think we had a very good notion of that at all. There were a few people who had a good understanding of parts of that, but I don't know that this was a major policy concern, and I think the general thrust of the information was quite limited.
So did that affect how we went about it, how the U.S. went about trying to tackle these different problems or groups?
Well, it didn't help, but I don't know that it was particularly important one way or the other.
How did the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, how did that affect how you had to do business with governments out there?
It's hard to tell whether there was more concern over the war in Iraq or more concern over visa limitations on students coming to America, or things like the Aceh insurgency. We were working with some NGOs to do this, and we would, with great difficulty, get a Achenese leader cleared with a visa to come to America, and then Homeland Security would turn them around at the airport, even with a visa, and send them back, just on the judgment of the visa officer at the airport. These things are marginal to the administration, but they're frustrating and difficult in the process. So the point was that our interests are much broader than the war on terrorism, and it tended to color and affect things, but it was certainly not decisive in any of these relationships. It's just something to work around and work through.
Did it make for lively discussions or debate when the different agencies came together?
No, I don't think so. The interagency process is difficult, and many of these things are in different channels. The policy channels, all the people I talked to, they were common issues. But dealing Homeland Security to this day, the Department of Homeland Security reports to 63 different congressional committees. It's they have some very capable officials. They have a lot of officials who know nothing. They merged the customs and immigration groups. My worm's eye observation over the years is that most of these guys hate each other, and so the immigration, when you've got a customs officer who's used to checking boxes and things, dealing with immigration, it gets kind of messy. So the whole task of organizing the Department of Homeland Security has been a monumental one over this time. It was for the Bush administration, and it continues for many years afterwards, and it'll continue for problems that head on off. So it was the only frustrating conversations I had that I can recall were in Malaysia. In other words, the diplomats that I saw and talked to, our people would describe what the problem was, but they didn't need an awful lot of convincing. In Malaysia, I found people I respected were not at the Mahathir level, but below the policy level, but were frustrated and had certainly been influenced to a degree by the media, and that it was coming across as a war on Islam, and that the U.S. is mistreating Islam. I did not have any conversations that I can recall in Indonesia along that line. I'm sure there were people I might have had that. I just didn't run into them, and I don't think our embassy necessarily saw them a lot.
Well, you have had the benefit of having worked in the Reagan White House in terms of policy making. Just in terms of a comparison between the two presidencies.
Well, in East Asia, we were very fortunate in the Reagan administration that President Reagan himself was a Californian, truly, and Secretaries Schultz and Weinberger both had spent a great deal of time in California. And Schultz and Weinberger did not personally like each other. And sometimes if one heard that the other had taken a position on something, he would disagree with it just because the other had. However, if we in the bureaucracy could get the decisions to both secretaries at the same time, and the other was not on the record, they would invariably come out in the same place. Their California interests, their interests in Asia were considerable, and this was also true of President Reagan. So that we had a unique sense of policy, of a single Asia policy that existed at the White House NSC, at the Pentagon, and in the State Department. Paul Wolfowitz was Assistant Secretary that I worked with for a while, and then with Gaston Seeger. I had known Paul somewhat in the 70s when we were both younger people. He's younger than I am. And then he went off to be ambassador to Indonesia. And whatever the many critics of Paul Wolfowitz may be, he did a wonderful job as ambassador to Indonesia and is still remembered and respected for the work and the interests that he did there. Gaston Seeger, a longtime professor and practitioner of Asian affairs, had come into the Reagan White House really as a part of that, and then went over to the State Department, and I was fortunate enough to replace him there. And then we had Assistant Secretary Rich Armitage over at the Defense Department, so we were really operating in a special degree of cooperation. And I would talk to State and the Pentagon every day from the Reagan NSC. And so we were, it was very smooth. And I knew that this was not the natural way of the bureaucracy. And we had more differences, not so much among the Asia people, but among some of the others, that so that there were some differences that would come up in North Korea in particular. Not so much over the overall direction, but whether there's any value in any talks with North Korea at all. And there's not much value in talks with North Korea, but it was very important to do that to keep our allies, Japan and South Korea, in a good place. And so that was what I worked toward, and I think we were able to have some limited successes in improving this sort of access. Success on North Korea, nobody outside has had any real successes on North Korea since the few parts of the Korean War that went well in 1952 or 51. And it's been a very great challenge ever since then, and remains that.
We've heard from other interviewees that there was a good deal of disagreement sometimes between state and defense, and sometimes even the White House under Bush too. Did that spill over into Asia policy?
It was extremely intense frequently, but only rarely did it do that, and it wasn't. It really wasn't a serious problem. I worked with Pentagon colleagues without any particular difficulties. We would have trouble getting things cleared with non-proliferators and other parts. That was much more intense. And ballistic missile defense was, of course, but that was not a major thrust of our policy concerns. And the White House, Dr. Rice sometimes would have different ideas than Secretary Powell did, but when it came to East Asia, I was 100% supported by President Bush from the White House. But there was a reluctance in the administration to tell those who had disagreed with the policies, and in some cases been voted down, to stop doing that would cause problems. So that it would be agreed that we would go over and enter into some dialogues that ended up as the six-party talks. So I didn't have a problem, but my Korea office director, those who had disagreed with that policy would really give them difficulty in clearing the documents. And the precise wording, we would get into problems. I myself was not so badly troubled by this, but it would constantly come up in difficult challenges, and so the first talking points would be very inflexible, but after that they got better. That was pretty much limited to the North Korea situation, where there was a lot of unhappiness with the agreed framework, and that gets very technical, and we can talk later or something about all these Korea questions, which were a separate one. China, the president wanted to have some contacts at the Defense Department, and I think Secretary Rumsfeld was very reluctant to do that, but slowly they improved that.
Speaking of China, when President Bush first became president, there was talk of treating China as a strategic competitor. It was a phrase that got some people quite
It appeared, I think, in Dr. Rice's, I started to look for it and didn't before I came here, Dr. Rice's Foreign Affairs article of late 2000, I think, strategic competitor. Best of my knowledge, that phrase was never used later on. It was true then, and it is used now, and it should be. But the translation into other languages of strategic competitor, the strategic element, in English is less loaded with military implications than it sometimes translates in other places. And so it quickly became fairly obvious. I don't recall any particular discussions. I think that probably was in the very early part of the White House, within the White House themselves. But I don't think we used the strategic competitor. We'd use various other things.
Actually, I was getting to that because observers have said that over time, over the course of the first Bush term, that phrase strategic competitor did get dropped by the wayside. But that was also because there was a greater willingness, thanks to 9/11, thanks to the turn of attention to the Middle East, there was a greater willingness to work more to work with the Chinese, to cooperate with the Chinese.
That's true.
So my first question is, would that be true? And second, what do you think of the criticism that because of this greater willingness to work with the Chinese, that we in some ways took our eyes off, their rise?
I don't think so. Their rise in particular, with the signing of with China's joining of the WTO, the explosive growth of the Chinese market and the effects that we're seeing here in 2016, particularly in terms of American politics, on loss of manufacturing jobs, even though it was primarily technology. But the explosion of Chinese trade was certainly major at that time. But it gets into the current political arguments that oppose all trade agreements are bad and we shouldn't have done this. It really contributed in major ways to all of Asia, because in many ways the explosion of the Chinese trade balances had to do with the diminution of the Japanese and Korean and Taiwan, particularly, trade balances, because they themselves were in this business of transition. It was a very complicated factor that people could see the numbers, but I don't think the dimension and the speed of which it was going on was fully recognized through the administration anywhere with an economic. And what we would have done about it if we had, in a way, it was heading for where we needed to go, but it certainly contributed to a hollowing out of at least certain kinds of exports within America. But it's a very complicated process. And there are not many of these that were direct moves off to China.
Some people have also said that the U.S. took its eyes off human rights issues, again, because it was so focused elsewhere.
To a degree, we never did take the eyes off. Every meeting with Chinese always involved bringing up human rights issues. We had, as in particular I saw, and we had the example of the Clinton administration before us. My predecessor, once removed, Winston Lord, was Assistant Secretary. And President Clinton, when he came to office, part of the 1992 campaign was President Bush had been cooperating too much with the butchers of Beijing, and they were going to stop that. And so they began a freeze of the policy with China in 1993, and early on in the process, they established 18 objectives that China had to make before the relationship would be fully normalized during that process. Well, that year went by, and they may be made halfway on one of the 18. And President Clinton had to eat all the rest of the 17 and picked up the relationship with China, and it was on the ground. So I was very mindful of that, and I think others in the administration were very mindful that if you try to dominate the relationship in human rights, you're going to end up without very much of a relationship, or the tools to affect that are so blunt and so large that as to be ineffective and unusable.
What about in terms of human rights issues in the rest of the region in Southeast Asia?
Well, ever since the Carter administration put human rights on the agenda, and it stayed, and I took that. The George Bush administration, we put in Lauren Craner as Assistant Secretary for Democracy and Human Rights. Our staffs would get into little arguments about the annual human rights report. We actually got into more difficulty on the trafficking in people's reports and the sanctions, the kind of automatic sanctions that would get loaded up on that. But we were very serious about dealing with those issues, and it invariably came up with the countries, primarily China, with which this was going to be a problem. But even so, when it came into trafficking laws and things like that, everybody, Japan and others, we would nudge them along, and having different officials try different degrees, I think that overall this has been an improvement that we've had. And in the Chinese, they're almost always ready to concede on particular individuals that get named. And I was vividly aware that this is a problem that we wanted to avoid, but we still got caught in it. They will take care of us by springing 3 or 4 or 6 from our short laundry list of individuals who are imprisoned in China. And actually, China is quite happy to exile these guys. I see he died this week. A famous Chinese dissident. Anyway,
I missed that.
My old age is getting, but the Gulag, he was an opponent of the Gulag and various things that went on back, and the endless lectures we would get from Chinese about Uyghurs and about the Falun Gong and all that sort of stuff. But it's part of the woodwork. But if we were also probably guilty of dodging it with the North Koreans as well. This is much more prominent, and after I left with legislation that came in, and the ambassador for human rights in Korea, but North Korea has so many things they need to do better that the focus on nuclear weapons is at least useful, even though it hasn't been any more effective than focus on human rights.
Human rights aside, were there particular efforts to, say, boost democracy building?
Oh, certainly were, and we would have was part of our programs and our assistance programs, and I think the feeling was that it was doing really quite well at the time, but at the time we had Indonesia go democratic. Certainly in the late 80s, South Korea did, Taiwan in a significant way. Democracy was seen as riding high there, and others were coming along. Burma was a constant problem. I never got to visit Burma because of the intractability. I think Burma is, by the way, an example of how the ASEAN way and slow persuasion over time was an element that has helped move things along in a significant but incomplete way.
What other, counterterrorism aside, what other efforts were made to boost security and stability in that region? How about maritime security, for instance?
The process was just starting to show up at that time in 2001 to 2005 of Chinese maritime interests. Their global economy, I think the switch of China from a net energy exporter to a net oil importer, at least, it was only about 1998 or 99 that switchover happened. So it was really just starting to begin at that time. The claims for the South China Sea that we see a lot about now were just, they were out there and thought to be silly, but the Chinese were making no particular efforts. Senkaku, Diaoyutai. While I was there was a couple. There were disputes of an oil rig that or a couple oil rigs the Chinese were doing in the East China Sea along the border, the midline border, and they worked something with Japan. But all of that was starting to develop, but very little of it had shown up at that time. China was still an army kind of a country, and talking a little bit about other things, but had not developed the maritime interests that we see now. So in terms of security, it was much more about stability, I think, than security. The discussions that we would have and maintaining contacts, obtaining support for our efforts in Iraq. We put in certainly a lot of time getting the Koreans and Japanese on that, and for that matter, the Filipinos on some effort there. The Australians were doing things. So there wasn't a lot going on beyond that, and working with the Pacific Command on what they do. The regional military commanders have a substantial diplomatic mission that goes beyond them, and I work very carefully with Tom Fargo, and we would speak regularly, and Denny Blair before that. I had known them in the past, and living in Hawaii and in other places, and our cooperation was all we could want. And I've told many of them, particularly when it deals with the South Pacific, that the American diplomatic and economic presence is all but nil down there, and that when the military leaders pay an occasional visit or help out in a disaster of some sort, that's probably the only contact that these countries are going to have in their country with us during the course of a year. Much of the cooperation is at the UN and things like that. And so in that respect, I have no complaints. And while I was there, we had a close cooperation with the White House and others. There were some Taiwan, there's always Taiwan issues, and that's a separate category.
Could you say more about the Pacific Command? Because that's come up a few times in other interviews as well. How big a role did they play in terms of both, not setting perhaps, but implementing Asia policy?
Big role, a substantial role. And as various Pacific commanders have testified, an excessive role. Not that they should be doing less, but that on the economic and soft power side, we're not able to match up with them as well. Otherwise, we are back in that time of 12, 15 years ago. As I mentioned, our development assistance was negligible. U.S. investors were present, but all my experience has been that if an American company is doing well overseas, they don't want to say a word, and they don't want anything help from government. If the two kind that you're going to hear from in government are those who have a particular concession that they need, for example, a cell phone, people need some block of frequency that they want the government to bang on the other government for, or they're an American business with no serious overseas interests at all, that just wants to block a competitor from overseas in some way. But that the full arrangement of the U.S., the full panoply of the U.S. relationship has been historically over the years probably a little more of the military side than we would want. This has improved recently, and I think has recognized presidents because the leaders' meetings, at first, before the mid-90s, there was nothing. And then APEC was developed, and after it had been going for 3 or 4 years, President Clinton put it into the APEC leaders meeting. It was after my time that the East Asia Summit has come in, and before that we have had for a long time the G7, and then for a while it was the G8, but only Japan is the presence there. And of course, going back well into the 90s, the importance of the relationship with China and visits of major Chinese leaders at different times have been been on the calendar.
So you left government in 2005.
Yes.
What is, and you left at the time when other top personnel
when
State Department also
Powell
left.
and Armitage left,
Right.
and I was going to leave, and it was about time for me to do that.
What is your assessment of the 4 to 5 years that you were working in the State Department during that term?
I was there for 3 years and 9 months, I guess, as Assistant Secretary, which is a good long time. I think the system of political appointments, if you're there much less than that, it's too short, and you don't get the continuity. Some people will stay longer, but certainly Condi Rice wanted to have her own team in there, and I understood that. But I had pretty much intended all along to get back. I was hitting 70 years old, and I thought it was about time to retire. My late wife, then at the time, did not much preferred living in our home in Hawaii than living in Washington, D.C., and so we were happy to go back as we had in 1989 after that time. So it worked for me, and I left and still feel very good about that time. I never came close to having to sell my soul as a political appointee in any respect. I remain interested in the Asian countries and travel there regularly, and I've now done that for 30-some years, and so feel that we did reasonably well. I'm sure there were many areas we could have done better, and set the stage for the things that have happened later on.
So you feel that under Colin Powell, Asia policy at least fulfilled most of its major objectives?
I think we did, and frankly, I think we did better than in the second term. But I think that had to do with Secretary Powell's interest, and Secretary Rice really didn't like. It was not her favorite thing to go visit Asia. And she brought in Chris Hill, a Euro guy, to take over the East Asia Bureau, and they're still recovering. And having, we have about 1,400 or 1,500 career State Department people, a very talented and able group. You get a lot of complaints about the State Department bureaucracy. Many of the complaints are probably true, but these are talented people that when they understand what the policy is and are asked to support it, they will do so. But too often they're kept in the dark. They don't know what the policy is, and it leads to stumbling around. I tried to avoid that, and I think we didn't have it. But Secretary Rice, Secretary Powell attended many meetings, boring meetings, the ASEAN Regional Forum, 24 or 25 countries, they come in and say their piece. There are some useful dialogues on the outside, but they had the American Secretary of State come and take his or her place there and sit there, and then they had these ridiculous skits that we had to do at that time. And do that it builds a relationship with these countries, and Secretary Powell was very mindful of that. It was not necessarily his favorite thing to do, and I think that was one reason that he brought me in. I think he felt that I would tell him what were things that he personally had to do, and that if there was something that he personally did not have to do, I wouldn't necessarily get him to do it. And I did that in the Reagan White House, and when I was working for him, and did it again later on. But I have a good feeling about that time.
What was it like working with Secretary Armitage?
Well, as I've mentioned, I've known him since he had left the Navy by that stage of his time in Vietnam, but he and I have worked together over a very long time. And when Armitage was Secretary of State, it was Chief Executive Officer and Chief Operating Officer relationship. You could say, you could report something to one of them, and it was the same as reporting it to both of them. They would talk many times every day, and they were on a coordinated basis. This is extremely rare. I'm sure we've never had such a close relationship between the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary at the State Department. Often they are heading off in completely different responsibilities. Sometimes, under Secretary Clinton, Jim Steinberg was there as the Obama representative to keep tabs on her. He's certainly a competent guy, but that was a very different kind of a relationship. I can't imagine what it's like now. Blinken may be running more of the department now, and Bill Burns certainly was, because Kerry he's never there, and I'm told he never reads any papers that anybody writes, so he's just off there as a sort of a figure, constantly showing up in different places. So it's a very different situation. And Powell, having come out of the Army, believed in training people and providing some leadership and supervisory training in the Foreign Service Institute for Foreign Service officers. He was aghast that, for example, in 1993 and 1994, when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the military services were phasing down by 30 or 40%, but he was intent on maintaining a base of younger officers in particular. You can't have all generals and no lieutenants. But at that time, when Warren Christopher was Secretary of State, the State Department went through 2 years of zero input into the Foreign Service. So that builds a 30-year bubble in which you don't have anybody of that seniority with or without experience to do this. It's no way to run a institution, and they were under financial pressures, and that's the choices that were made at that time. But Powell and Armitage were both determined to professionalize and endorse the awful technical solutions that existed. The last Wang computers in the world were found at the State Department long after, like 15 years after the last of these had come on. And so he was determined that everybody at the State Department could reach the internet on their desk. And there were a lot of improvements. I think there's still a lot more that needs to be done. And so that support for the people, I think, paid some dividends. But the whole idea is to professionalize the process more than it has been for the career people, who are a core group in implementing any policies that you have.
You mentioned Burma earlier. Just curious to know, I remember being out in Southeast Asia at that time and hearing a lot of the ASEAN countries say, boy, the US is just so hung up on Burma. If only they would adopt more of the ASEAN way. Why did the US resist that?
In Washington, D.C., many policies of countries that are not deemed to be major American interests, with lobbies and interest groups of a large scope, the policies are driven by non-governmental organizations, NGOs. And Burma policy, by the time I came in, was utterly driven by NGOs who were holier than the Pope, so to speak, holier than Aung San Suu Kyi. That still existed to a degree with Malaysia, and in a major way with Indonesia. Indonesia had gone through a profound change after the East Timor dust-ups and after the transition from Suharto. We still had all kinds of sanctions that limited our contacts with the Indonesian armed forces, which we were trying to professionalize, particularly in the war on terrorism. And so, in a sense, I threw Burma under the bus to get the relief from the Congress and the NGO-driven sanctions that we had there. But we weren't making any progress. Priscilla Clapp, an extremely capable person, was our representative without the rank of ambassador out there in Burma. We had one break of about 2002 when they released Daw Aung Suu Kyi. from her confinement and enabled the NLD. And so I was setting up to go in and have a visit into Burma, and they rolled her up within a month or so and shot up a bunch of her motorcade and threw everybody into insane jail, and it was bad news. So there really wasn't we could do, and the sanctions then got redoubled after that. So the highest Washington calling, in my view, is an expression of indignation. And NGOs prompt these expressions of indignation. Sanctions, in many cases, are Washington, D.C. expressions of indignation. They don't necessarily have any particular effect. They are often entirely counterproductive, but they make their organizers feel particularly to receive the applause of an NGO. So in other words, there's no Burma lobby. There's nobody, very few people. Professor Steinberg, for example, at Georgetown, would constantly get in trouble by suggesting some improvement. In the end, I think the U.S. didn't do much, but they did do a few things long after my time there. And Senator Jim Webb, who traveled to, when he was chairman of the East Asia, served that one term in the Senate between nutty behaviors in the past and in the present. But when it came to Asia, Jim Webb was a very helpful guy, and he went in and met with the Burmese leaders. And it was right about that time that constitution was put together, which was dismissed out of hand in Washington, hopeless, just to saying, well, the fact is there was a lot more to that, and the ASEANs were working it. But to the extent that I don't know, that was after my time. But we didn't have any openings there. But I had to go along with pathetic and useless and counterproductive sanctions on Burma because that was the price that the NGOs would pay. To ride over to a hearing before the Appropriations Committee with Secretary Powell. This is the Appropriations Committee visit from the Secretary of State. And when a major senator, who's chairman, I think, of the subcommittee or ranking minority member, and I'm telling Powell, I said, the only questions you will get from this senator will be about Burma or Cambodia. The whole world is there, and all he's going to get, because there's an important staffer for this president who is inflamed by the NGOs and has a personal vendetta against someone there. Those sort of personal vendettas with a country without large interests in Washington can drive the train, and they do drive the train, and very much affect the policy, or at least to the extent that the Congress can influence it in terms of the power of the purse, or by enacting sanctions on things they don't like and leaving the sanctions on long after their whatever minor usefulness they might have had has been passed. So as you see, I'm not a fan of congressional management of international relations.
Well, may I ask you, you talk about congressional on that issue. Did you get any direction or advice, you might say, from the White House on the Burma issue? Because we know that the First Lady and her office were very focused on Burma.
That was more in the second term, I think, that happened. It may have started to happen, and I was certainly, I don't recall being aware of First Lady interest in Burma when I was there. And I'm not sure that I think her major interest took on later on, and may have been in part of a conversation that she and Gandhi might have had. I sure would have paid attention, and we would have I think it was a positive interest and influence that Mrs. Bush had. We probably would have played things in a different way. I wouldn't have. I made no attempt to seriously resolve anything on the sanctions during my time there. But it was totally intractable. This was before that Constitution was done. And the one opening we had, they really shut it down in a nasty and obnoxious way. So there wasn't much we could do.
You also mentioned Cambodia just a minute ago. Do you think that our discussion has largely focused on the maritime countries? Mm-hmm. Do you think that you or anyone in the State Department or the White House, for that matter, might have missed an opportunity with Cambodia or Laos?
No, I don't think so. Let's see. My assistant secretaries for East Asia sometimes I may or may not have been called assistant secretary for North Korea, because I did have to spend a lot of time on North Korea. Stanley Roth, my predecessor, the second term of the Clinton administration, was sometimes called assistant secretary for East Timor. And Dick Solomon, back in the first Bush administration, was assistant secretary for Cambodia, which shows how long that's been going on in the UN process there. That was the closest thing to a political division we've had in East Asia policy in the Reagan administration. Many Democrats, in particular Dick Holbrooke, felt that we were entirely too loose in developing the relationship because of the Khmer Rouge elements. Even though Zbig Brzezinski was the one who cooked that up. But that was very controversial in the Carter administration and continued on. Well, that all was long water under the bridge by the time that I came in there. So I did visit Cambodia. We had an APEC there. I was there once or twice otherwise. We didn't have a lot of tools that we could use. Somebody recently said, and Laos was even less, though, that the Chinese may rent Cambodia, but they own Laos. And that's a real shift, because Vietnam was the big influence in Laos for all those years, and that has been diminished, and I don't know whether the Chinese own it. But going back to Khmer Rouge days when I was in the 80s at the Pentagon and then at the White House, the Chinese clearly had people embedded with the Khmer Rouge during that period, which was before Hun Sen had taken over. But all we could do was try to nudge Cambodia in the right direction, and it's basically the same as it's been. And part of it was the futility of his opposition there. When you have this is what's different in Myanmar. Aung San Suu Kyi is not only a reputational patriot, and like any person, she has strengths and weaknesses. She's often exaggerated as the whole solution, but she's a major player, and she has political instincts that are substantial for the country. In Cambodia, Sihanouk and the Funcinpec, French-oriented group of the descendants of Prince King Sihanouk. A pathetic group, grossly lacking in touch with it. And then there's Sam Rainsy, and he's still up to various hijinks, collaborating with him 1 month, dodging jail, heading off to Paris another month. These are not effective opposition forces that you can effectively deal with. So Hun Sen has cemented his role, made many concessions to U.S. It is an improved situation, and probably in just about every respect over what it was. It could be better, I suppose, but it's not. So that's my take on that.
So, would you say there was a particular high point of your 3 years or 9 months in that position? Was there one particular episode or a particular issue that you feel particularly proud of?
The single thing I'm probably most proud of is I thought, Japan was just being a part of something that was moving along reasonably well. Korea, I spent a great deal of time on, and I made a particular effort getting in the discussions with North Korea. We needed to have the South Koreans as a equal and full participant side by side with us. That was not the case through the 90s and before. North Koreans would talk with anybody, but they wouldn't talk with the South Koreans. In fact, a whole major thrust of North Korea's policy all this time is they want to talk to America so they don't have to talk to South Korea. Because in the end, whatever resolution ends up in Korea, it will be because the South and the North the South has somehow absorbed the North in the end. And the North knows this. And so its last resort at any time is dealing with South Korea when it has no other alternatives. It's trying to get China to give it something, trying to get the Russians to give it something. This is, of course, all basically changed. Japan subsidized North Korea big time for all those years because of direct payments in gold to senior Japanese politicians. That all passed 25 years ago. That passed from the scene, and the Japanese, all those pachinko parlors, stopped paying taxes to North Korea. This has led to much of the economic problems that North Korea has had since then, along with the end of the Cold. When it came soon after the end of the Cold War, and the big subsidies they had, particularly from the Soviet Union, had ended. So, but getting South Korea in part, our first three-party talks, I flew into South Korea and felt, there was a scrum of reporters and media around there. My 15 minutes of fame in South Korea really went on, and many still claimed to remember that. But I felt personally awful about who am I, representative of the USA, coming in from China and talks to the North Koreans to tell South Koreans about what's going on with their neighbor. They need to be firsthand on that scene, and we were able to pull that off with the Chinese, and a lot of it was the South Koreans' own effort in doing that and getting that in. This was opposed by jackasses in the administration, not including the Asia staff at the White House, and not including President Bush, but they were saying, this is just an excuse for direct America talks with North Korea. The Japanese and the South Koreans are just going to be playing gin rummy. Well, that wasn't true at all. And they were substantial players in this, although the Japanese kept getting distracted on the nuclear agreement because of the political pressure they were getting on the abduction issue.
You had made some mention already about Secretary Rice when she took over the State Department. What's your sense? What's your assessment of what missed opportunities went on it with the second term under Secretary Rice?
I don't know that I've thought about it in that particular way.
What's your general assessment of their approach?
Well, it was a continuation, and of course the whole focus of the administration was on the problems in the war in Iraq, the changes that went on, the surge in Iraq, and how that began to work, and bringing Bob Gates into as Secretary of Defense. So those are much larger problems. Some people have told me of the difficulties that Secretary Rice would have in dealing with the Vice President, and Rumsfeld would really give her a bad time at some of these meetings. So in Asia, I don't know that we certainly didn't miss major opportunities. It was all the cosmetics of it and the gardening that Secretary Schultz talks about. So maybe a weed turned up here or there. Chris Hill did not have I don't think he had the interest in things throughout the region that I had. He would be a little quicker to publicly dismiss talks with one official or another as a waste of time, and he's not wrong about things like that, but efficient use of time and building relationships over a period of time, I think, is very important. I can't name, and I don't think any serious ill effects happened from any of that. There may have been positive effects from some of these things. And so Dr. Rice would miss some of the ASEAN meetings. History is not going to be different because she missed those, but part of being there is a big part of the process, and she knows this, and that was a part of it. So I have no significant criticisms to make.
Overall, then, what would you say was the legacy that the Bush Asia people left to the Obama administration?
What has been the case for a long time with East Asia, which is that the U.S. needs to be a part of it, that East Asia is not waiting for some signal from Washington, D.C. about what they ought to do. East Asia is going to develop in its own way, under its own pressures. The U.S. is a welcome participant in many respects, if in all respects with some countries, in many respects even with others. The U.S. has important interests in East Asia, and we have to work on them and develop them for over a period of time. And that's what we do. There's no, it's the part of the world where things are really going pretty well, and let's don't do anything to screw it up, but at the same time, let's be involved there. And many administrations have to get to that point by a slow process, and I think the Obama administration has gotten better on it, although Secretary Clinton, I think, tried well otherwise. And if the TPP is rejected, this will again bring the criticism that too much of our relationship is driven by military, and that'll be a true complaint.
What do you make of the so-called pivot to Asia? Some people have said, it's just terminology. After all, in the Bush administration, there was already some pivoting to Asia. Others have said, no, this is quite substantively different. What do you think?
It's a little of both. The pivot was a wrong, a poor word to use in the beginning, because it suggested that we had been inactive and out of the game in Asia, and that wasn't true. It's really a rebalancing, which is the term that they use, and it's evolved probably in a healthy way, but it was designed, I think, by the Obama administration to, with the withdrawal from Iraq that they thought they had pulled off, and the intended withdrawal from Afghanistan that they still hope to do, that they weren't signaling a complete abandonment of Asia. And part of the withdrawal from that was intended to be reassurance of American participants otherwise. And so it ended up some Europeans feeling even less interest than what they would have, and the complaint being made that it's too much militarization. So the decision that they would have 60% of the American Navy in the Pacific, I think they had 58% before. So it's a very marginal shift, and part of it represents shortcomings of resources. But now it's had a different kind of life because of the maritime challenges in Southeast Asia, and how the Trans-Pacific Partnership is developing.
Is there any question that I should have asked but did not ask?
Well, let me look and see. Let's see if I can read my writing there. I think, look, your first point on foreign policy priorities of the late 90s, before the Bush administration. The Japan relationship had been firmed up about 1997, although we also had the commitment from after 1995 on Okinawa relocation, which is still happening. The WTO agreement with China. We've talked about Cambodia and East Timor. But the 1998 financial crisis that affected South Korea and Thailand and Indonesia, Malaysia in particular, we haven't talked about, but that was a very important development. And there really has to be a big economic component in what we did. But the Secretary Larry Summers of Treasury stiffing of the ties has led to a general deterioration, fully aside from the internal things going on in Thailand that was unfortunate. In Indonesia, it's actually worked out well, but that picture of the IMF solution to Indonesia, which probably wasn't so good, but it helped bring down the end of Suharto, and unlike in a lot of countries, we ended up better than we were to begin with in Indonesia. Malaysia, of course, resisted this sort of pressure, and it's continued to resist pressure in different ways, but they turned out to be more correct than others were, and some of it may have been smallness of the economy. We didn't go into the legacy of North Korea, and I don't know that we need to. Number two, foreign policy priorities in the region in the first 9 months. The policy review on North Korea, I think, was important. The agreed framework, the 1994 agreement, was upheld and supported until we got significant intelligence about an alternative method of developing fishable material. A big influence then, and part of my first trips out to Asia before 9/11, was about supporting ballistic missile defense. And this was really a major issue for the administration. And then working with the allies and strengthening the alliances, I think, was clearly intended. How did 9/11 affect less than in many other regions in the world? We've talked about all the other things. Although Japan's refueling services in the Indian Ocean, that was a lot of money that was supported of U.S. forces, the Japanese tankers that did that, and to some degree the forces they had in Iraq. And then others who we urged to participate in Iraq. Mongolia I've mentioned, didn't mention. South Korea, Philippines, we have talked about. The internal debate, I think we've talked about the contrast of China before and after 9/11. There were challenges on special forces and the role of an ambassador, and whether the ambassador would be fully responsible for all the things that happen within that country. I'm not sure if all of that has been fully resolved, but I think it's really necessary that anti-terrorist security-related activities need to be, the ambassador needs to be aware of these things. I don't know if that's been fully solved.
Are you thinking of a particular country?
No, it was a general issue that first came up with some of the movement of special forces in different areas. A specific example that came up, or there was one I recall with Indonesia, in which military forces on the special forces side were being identified to get some terrorist training camp in a fairly remote but a part of Indonesia. And this was fortunately reconsidered, but they didn't know where this so-called camp was. And we're going to land special forces and have them wander around, I don't know, riding jeeps looking for this place. Ask the Indonesians. Get some proper Indonesians to cooperate with us. In the end, I think that's what was done. But that it was a sign of the sort of desperation that they were going to take some sort of action. We could have spoiled our relationship for 50 years with an important country over something like that. And there are probably some of those aspects, but that was the sort of tension that came up. But wise heads prevailed, and stupid things, as far as I know, were not done.
So was that sort of directive coming from defense?
Yeah, I think this was an idea that some people had, like the Don Rumsfeld memo to the president. Hey, we've got how to take care of North Korea. Let's get the Chinese to take out the head of North Korea. Oh, good. I'm glad you thought of that, Secretary. Get the Chinese to do it. My colleague John Bolton, that's long been in the end, he always complains for 90% of whatever article is about American policy towards Korea, North Korea. Then the last 10% is, what do you do other than what we're doing? Well, you get the Chinese to do it. Oh, great idea. A lot of people still think that's a good idea. It's not a bad idea either. Retrospective assessment of how U.S. policy was implemented and its impact. I think Japan, excellent. Singapore and China went well after some doubts in Beijing. On Korea six-party talks, I think that was a continuum that did my successor's agreement of September of 2005, I think remains a significant agreement to which the North Koreans are a party, and at some time it may turn out to be useful again at some point. The China story is Hu Jintao, who became president of China, and at the time was vice president of China, and it was rumored, or the likelihood was that he was going to become president of China, and he had not visited America before. And so as vice president of China, somewhere, I guess in 2002, he, at a fairly early time in the administration, but well after 9/11, he came to Washington. And I had my job as assistant secretary to go out to the airport and welcome him in. And he came off trailed by a long variety of Chinese vice ministers. They were all their game faces were on, very serious. And that night, Secretary Powell had a dinner for him. It was all correct and everything went well. Well, it turns out, I think I had some indication of that at the time, but there was a sense in Beijing that the U.S. And the Bush administration were going to try to have a two-China policy, one China, one Taiwan. I think this was exaggerated based on around the time I was confirmed in April of 2002, a questionnaire to the president said, well, what will you do to defend Taiwan? He said, whatever it takes. Which then lots of things were written into the language of what that was going to be. But clearly, Hu Jintao, when he arrived in Washington, was deeply concerned, in my estimation, over two things. One, whether his visit was going to be seen as substantive enough and he would really become president of China. And second, if the U.S. was going to try to pull off a two-China policy, this was going to be a very adverse development because the Chinese system really would not have been able to take that, and we were going to have a very tense relationship afterwards. And he didn't know, although enough had generally been said, although I don't think it had all been very clearly defined at that stage. But the following day he met with Vice President Cheney and then went immediately into his meeting with the president. And it was very clear from Cheney that the policy of the one China policy was going to be observed. The familiar language was used about Taiwan, that the and the same happened with President Bush. And then who gave another speech, and there were a couple other dinners and things, but he was visibly relieved when it was a youngster who had just passed a big test in school. He was obviously happy. And out at the airport on his departure, here is Hu Jintao, who is not a demonstrative man. He has never deviated in his life from a talking point, and didn't afterwards, which is part of why Xi Jinping is showing as much authority as he has. But there was Hu with this great big smile, followed by 9 vice ministers with big grins on them, and he's shaking my hand and said, and he shifted into English, said, "Thank the president, thank the vice president. I very much enjoyed this visit here." And just seeing these guys who came in, they're grim-faced, and 2 days later, they're leaving I mean, both sides. He knew his path was clear to be president of China, and then he was going to be able to have a solid working relationship with the U.S. And of course, there were difficulties because that was the first DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, who had taken office about 7 months before President Bush became president, and some later members of the administration had caused the Taiwans to think that the U.S. was ready to break off a diplomatic relationship with China and open one up with Taiwan. That was never in the cards. It was never likely. But there were people in Taiwan who wanted to believe that and thought they would believe it, and it caused President Bush, later on, when the Premier of China, Wen Jiabao, was visiting, to publicly complain about. This was not something that the staff was in. This was in the pre-brief. The president told us he was going to do this. I think he had read some intelligence that day that Chen Shui-bian had told somebody about, "Don't worry about the Americans. I've got them taken care of." So the president had a few words about that in the presence of the premier of the mainland, who certainly didn't mind hearing them, and it certainly affected. And we've got another DPP administration coming up. I think Ms. Tsai will be a lot smarter, and she's had her own tough moments too in Washington.
I have one question about President Bush's meetings with various leaders in Asia. You did say earlier that he didn't care for lunches, he didn't care for these fancy dinners that tend to come with.
And as a non-drinker,
right,
they have wonderful wines at the State Department, but he doesn't want to waste a lot of time while other people are enjoying their wine. So he's got that staff. They can get the stuff, the plates on your plate. If you don't eat it quickly, it'll be gone.
What's your sense of how foreign leaders thought of their meetings with President Bush? Did it generally go well? What were the impressions they had of him?
It almost always went well. And one example would be No Mo-hyun, the leftist leader of South Korea, who was elected in kind of an odd election, and I think never dreamed he would be president of South Korea. His meetings with President Bush were enormously successful. I used to laugh. That was like when people are subject to cholera things, you get a gamma globulin shot that will give you an extra immunity for 6 weeks or 2 months or so. That it was kind of a gamma globulin shot that the president would give, that for 2 months, President No, who didn't try to be difficult, but had a lot of difficult people in his administration, it would be wonderful, and then it would sort of wear off and we'd get into more troubles. But even then, so in that was a clear case. And generally speaking, that was almost all the meetings that I can think of went well that way. They're not scheduled. You don't schedule a meeting if things are going badly. And so any presidential meeting that goes off the tracks, that's very, very unusual. And in a way, you could say that March 15th meeting that I mentioned earlier with Kim Dae-jung went off the tracks. But when President Bush himself went to South Korea early in 2002, right before not before the inauguration, I think that President Kim Dae-jung, once again, had developed a rather good relationship, and on the scene, explaining just how close Seoul is to the demilitarized zone. This is I think actually that the North Koreans had a nuclear weapon even at that time of some sort, but that the conventional deterrence, just all that artillery within range of Seoul is such. And when the president took that helicopter, he ended up with a stronger statement after his conversations with President Kim of Korea. I think it ended up in a much more cooperative way than any logic would have been expected. And I don't think the press picked up on that really at all, but it was quite significant. Although it is also true that around that time, the president was focused on the problem of Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, and how we're going to deal with this, and whether or not it had a link to terrorism. And so North Korea was seen as a kind of a distraction. But it was much more than that I think the president took on board.
Did you ever get the impression of any Asian leader, maybe not so much lecturing, but certainly pointing out to President Bush that he was getting distracted by the war on terror? That there were more
I certainly don't recall anybody ever saying anything like that. And I think that would be very unusual. Were
these meetings, again, speaking very generally, were these meetings mostly a sort of business as usual, a meeting with the president being the cherry on the cake, or did any of these meetings ever actually push something forward that might not have been able to have been achieved?
Well, I think the incident in which the remark was made by President Bush about President of Taiwan and the limits of American support of Taiwan that were there would be one example. I don't think I think of others.
Anything you want to add? Okay, well, I think
All
in that
right.
case, we'll wrap up the interview.
Good.
Thank you very much, Mr.
Good.
Kelly.
12 noon. All right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for being so patient
Oh, glad to do it.
and generously sharing your time.